name is Dick Campbell, and for many years I have been a student of history. And with this interest, I have created a variety of history talks, which I presented to many local groups and other organizations throughout Wisconsin, and even up in Fairbanks, Alaska. I call these talks Great Moments in History. And now I would like to share one of those moments with you, entitled The Klondike Gold Rush. One of the most exciting chapters in the history of North America was written more than 2,000 miles from civilization. The time was the late 1890s, and the event was the Klondike Gold Rush in the Yukon Territory of Canada. No gold rush in history could match the Klondike Rush of 1896 to 1899. In the almost insane drive of people to conquer distance and weather conditions to reach the rich deposits of placer gold in the frozen barren area of the Klondike River. This is their story. Gold, element number 79 on the chemist's periodic table. Gold is a heavy, malleable metal that can be found in its free state either as dust or nuggets, or embedded in quartz lodes. Gold is a remarkable quality mineral, but its most remarkable quality is what it does to people. For thousands of years in cultures around the world, gold has been coveted, valued, and cherished. It was gold, for instance, that drove Cortez and Pizarro to conquer the Aztec and Inca civilizations. It was gold that drove tens of thousands of 1849ers to California's mother lode. And it was gold that caused more than 100,000 adventurers from around the world to leave home and family and strike out for the Klondike in 1897 and 1898. And incidentally, the three pictures that I have up right now are of three of the largest nuggets ever found in Alaska, to give you an idea of its value. These three gold pieces weigh a total of 387 ounces. And back in 1898, gold was valued at around $18 per ounce, which would make these three pictures worth about $7,000 in 1898. Today, and one of the latest figures I have is gold at around $1,350 an ounce. These three nuggets would be worth over $520,000. At no other time or place in recorded history did so many people voluntarily subject themselves to so much agony, misery, death, and glory. It can only be compared with an army in retreat or refugees in flight, victims of the madness attending war. Before going any further, let me review some points about Alaska and its adjoining territory. When the United States purchased Alaska from Russia in 1867 for $7.2 million, that's about $12 per square mile. Little was known about this vast and diverse territory. When you look at a map of Alaska, what you notice first is the scale. Here is a land where superlatives abound and comparisons are few. Highest mountain in North America, Denali. Third longest river system in North America, the Yukon. Largest national park, the Wrangell St. Elias. Southernmost tidewater glacier in North America, LeConte. Northernmost town in North America, Barrow. Largest U.S. national forest, the Tongass. and the largest subpolar ice field in the world, the Bagley Ice Field. Alaska is 586,400 square miles of rugged mountains, grinding glaciers, broad rivers, and rushing streams. This picture gives you the comparative size of Alaska to our lower 48 states. The Klondike is not in Alaska. Rather, its richest diggings were a good 60 miles east of the international boundary, marked here in yellow, well within Canada's Yukon Territory. Thus, the story of the Klondike and its legends all belong to the Yukon Territory. The Klondike story that belongs to Alaska is that of the amazing routes on which the stampeders cut across its rugged landscape in order to reach, or at least attempt to reach, the gold fields. The more realistic avenues were the Yukon River from the west and the routes over the Chilkoot and White Pass trails out of the newly developed towns of Skagway and Dyea from the southeast. Well, what was the spark that ignited the stampede to the Klondike goldfields in the 1890s? In 1896, Robert Henderson, a longtime prospector in the north, had found some gold color near Bonanza Creek. And shortly thereafter, he met George Carmack, a white man, who had married an Indian woman and two of her Indian relatives named Tagish Charlie and Skookum Jim. As was the custom of the prospectors in the area, Henderson told Carmack about his discovery and suggested that Carmack do some prospecting. Well, Henderson had no love for Indians, and he told Carmack to stake a claim alone. Well, this remark cost Henderson the wealth that had eluded him for years, because on August 17, 1896, the Skookum Party discovered rich placer gold deposits in Bonanza Creek, Yukon. It's not clear who made the actual discovery, but George Carmack was officially credited for the gold discovery because the actual claim was staked in his name, as shown at the top of this application. The group agreed to this because they felt that other miners would be reluctant to recognize a claim made by an Indian, given the strong racist attitudes of the time. Within days, Bonanza and El Dorado Creeks had been staked from end to end. Carmack neglected to tell poor Henderson, who missed out entirely on the richest claims. Henderson's superior attitude toward the Indians had cost him a fortune. By the following spring of 1897, the town of Dawson, at the junction of the Klondike and Yukon rivers, was a boom town of about 1,500 miners who had congregated there from all over Alaska and northwest Canada. Many prospectors, lucky enough to get on the ground floor, got rich during that first winter of 1896-97. But the communication with the outside world was notoriously unreliable, and few outsiders had any information about the gold strike. The miners worked all that winter until the spring thaw of 1897 carried away the ice on the Yukon River. And once the ice went out on the Yukon, a motley assortment of river steamers arrived in Dawson to transport many of the lucky, now wealthy miners out to civilization with their winter's take of gold. They traveled 1,700 miles down the Yukon River to the town of St. Michael on the west coast of Alaska. And there they transferred to the coastal steamers named Excelsior and Portland. On July 15, 1897, the Excelsior docked in San Francisco with the first news of the gold strike. On board were the disheveled and hard-bitten miners. But the word soon spread that these miners carried more than a ton of solid gold from the Yukon River Basin. And by the time the passengers were off the boat, they were being mobbed and treated like conquering heroes. The scene was even more chaotic in Seattle, where the steamer Portland arrived on July 17 with 68 miners and gold reportedly worth more than $700,000. The gold strike was confirmed and the stampede was on. It was said that the gold fields were rich beyond anyone's wildest dreams. As news spread around the world, people quit their jobs, took their savings, left their families, and headed for the promised land. A kind of mass lunacy had seized the continent. And by July 19, over 5,000 people jammed the Seattle docks to find a ship to take them and their supplies north to the gold fields. It was as if everyone had been waiting for an excuse to break free. Somewhere, just beyond the horizon's rim, and few knew exactly where, lay wealth, adventure, and perhaps, more important, release from the dreariness of the decade. In the next 24 hours, 2,000 New Yorkers tried to buy tickets to the Klondike. In the first week, hundreds quit their jobs. Within a month, tens of thousands had followed suit. Streetcar operators deserted their trams, policemen their beats, and pastors their charges. Clerks walked out of offices, salesmen jumped counters, and reporters quit their desks. The mayor of Seattle, attending a convention in San Francisco, did not even bother to return home, but wired in his resignation and joined the herd rushing to the Klondike. So strong was their faith in the magic of the Klondike that 500 widows seeking rich husbands chartered a steamer and set off from New York City around the Horn of South America for the gold fields. And in spite of shipwreck and Patagonian cannibals, managed to limp into Seattle before their funds were dissipated and their dreams shattered. Why would anyone leave their home to travel to the Klondike gold fields? Well, the answer cannot be found in bank accounts or photo albums. Instead, consider the human spirit of the late 1890s. A severe depression called the Panic of 1893 rocked the American economy, putting prosperous businesses into bankruptcy and sending the nation's morale into a downward spiral. There was no end in sight to the desperation felt by the thousands of unemployed. Also, in 1890, the Census Bureau declared that the western frontier had closed. The information that the census collected indicated that every region of the contiguous United States had experienced settlement. For the wanderers, the adventurers, and the explorers, this was the end of an era. The only place left to them was the Great North, Alaska and Northwest Canada, the last frontier. Merchants in Seattle, who in the past 4 years had been feeling the effects of the 1893 panic, were suddenly set upon by frenzied miners preparing for the journey north. Because the Canadian government required that each stampeder bring enough supplies with him to last 1 year. This averaged to about 2,000 pounds and a cost of about $500 in Seattle. Many guidebooks were written, with an example pictured here entitled Klondike, the Chicago Records Book for Gold Seekers in 1897. And there were about 4 or 5 of these kind of books, hardbound books that were put together. They're over an inch thick. I have a couple in my office at home. And they told you everything you needed to know, hopefully, to get up to the Klondike and find some gold. Each of them had suggestions on what supplies should be taken along. And here's a list in one of the books. And I'm not going through the entire list, but it ranges from up in the top from 400 pounds of flour to, at the lower part of the list, to an iron stove and tent and all types of food and supplies in between. Everybody wanted to go to the Klondike, but few knew where the gold fields were or how to get there. 1 million people laid plans to go. 100,000 actually set off. And so the Klondike Saga is a chronicle of humanity in the mass, of thousands squeezed onto wharfs, jamming street corners, choking roadways, of men, women, horses, and dogs, crushed together below decks on overloaded steamers, of beaches crowded with prospectors and pack animals, of dense lines of gold seekers struggling up mountain slopes, of rivers and lakes alive with watercraft, of gutted valleys buzzing like hives and ramshackle villages bursting into little cities. One cannot help but speculate that while the gold was certainly important, this was the last great fling of a generation that sensed that the adventure and excitement of the American West was passing from the scene forever. For many, it was as if one writer wrote, quote, "Not the gold that we were after, so much as just finding the gold," unquote. Another writer, Clarence Berry, warned that it would not be easy. Quote, "The country is wild, rough, and full of hardships for those unused to the rigors of Arctic winters. If a man makes a fortune, he is liable to earn it by severe hardship and sufferings. But then, grit, perseverance, and luck will probably reward a hard worker with a comfortable income for life." Unquote. Within days of Berry's words, tens of thousands of gold seekers were bound for the Klondike. There was no one route to the Klondike. The winter of 1897-98 found stampeders spread out across the entire northwestern part of the North American continent on a dozen or more routes. Despite the many courses, the collective experience of the last great gold rush would come to be symbolized by a photograph of a long single file line of humanity struggling upward under incredible weight to reach the 3,739-foot summit of Chilkoot Pass. Long before each person in turn reached the top, the reality of Berry's words had sunk in. The easiest course, though also the most expensive, simply retraced the route taken by the Excelsior and Portland. This one took the gold seekers 3,000 miles from Seattle to the mouth of the Yukon River at St. Michael in about 15 days, and then by other vessels upriver for 1,700 miles to Dawson in about 15 to 20 days. This route was so long, however, that almost no one who took it arrived in Dawson before the Yukon River froze up in October of 1897. Approximately 10% of the stampeders used this route. The most successful course was the sea-land route up the Inside Passage. Leaving Seattle, stampeders took a ship for 1,600 miles to Skagway or Dyea, twin ports at the head of the Lynn Canal in Alaska. They then traveled by foot over the Chilkoot Pass in red on the picture, or the White Pass Trail in green to Lakes Lindeman and Bennett in Canada. It was here that they built boats to carry themselves and their supplies down the Yukon River to Dawson. The demand for steamships to carry passengers to the Klondike was high, and ships were pulled off of other routes to fill the need. Any patched-up vessel that could be resurrected was pressed into service on the Pacific Coast Run. Yachts, sloops, barks, scows, barges, steamboats, and sailing schooners all headed north, crammed with men, women, and animals. Crowds on the docks were so desperate for berths on any vessel going north that scores refused to give up their place in line to eat or sleep. Thousands fought for tickets or robbed those who had tickets or bribed their way on board. Some passengers were packed into a cabin on bunks of rough lumber. Others lived in suffocating holes or on the deck, even in the driving rain. They slept in their clothes, waited many hours for terrible meals, suffered storms, explosions, starvation, shipwreck, mutiny, and mayhem. Dogs died in their crates. Men were swept overboard in storms. Horses kicked each other into insensibility, and yet the stampeders suffered it all because at the end of the ghastly sea journey, the beaches of Skagway and Dyea beckoned. And beyond the beaches lay the mountains, the mountain trails, and the lakes. And beyond the lakes lay the great river. And at the river's end lay Mecca. Over 9,000 people and 36,000 tons of supplies left Seattle in the first 6 weeks of the gold rush in 1897. When the stampeders arrived at the end of their sea journey through the 90-mile-long Lynn Canal pictured here, they faced the start of another journey at the beaches of Skagway and Dyea. At last they realized that the journey to the land of gold would be no easy stroll. 2 trails, the White Pass Trail from Skagway in green and the Chilkoot Trail from Dyea in red, crossed through the Coast Range passes to Lakes Lindeman and Bennett, the headwaters of the Yukon River. But to reach the passes, each man must disembark with his 2,000 pounds of supplies and his animals onto the tidal flats, which were a mile from land with no sign of a wharf to help them get there. Over the side they went, men, horses, dogs, and baggage, into the freezing ocean or into snub-nosed scows shown here, shuttling back and forth over this wet expanse to a point above the high water mark, always for a hefty fee. There was more than one who lost the battle with the advancing tide, lost not only the possessions he had saved and scrimped for, but also his chance to push on towards the gold fields. For the Yukon was empty of food. No man could enter without a year's supply. Here, for many, the dream ended. For those who won the battle, they pushed on to join the endless chain of men and women greedily trudging northward through the wet sand and the yellow gumbo and rapidly falling snow, up through the forest and into the canyons, along the trail of dead horses. Only after leaving the beaches did the stampeders begin to comprehend the travail that faced them. Many who had arrived in 1897 wanted to believe that the 40-mile White Pass Trail was the better route, as it was 600 feet lower than the Chilkoot Trail and only about 10 miles longer. However, ahead lay a narrow footpath, viscous with slime and shale, snaking upward toward the summit. Each man must climb the mountain, flogging his horses or driving his dogs, not once, but many times, as he shuttled his 2,000 pounds of goods and food and supplies forward, a few pounds at a time, through rain, sleet, and blizzard, as part of an impersonal chain of groaning animals and humans. 3,000 horses died on the White Pass Trail during the first 2 months of the rush. Some, badly loaded, died violently, losing their balance and plunging from the cliff edges to the waters below. Some vanished in mud holes or were drowned in the river. Many died of cruel treatment and exhaustion. By September 1897, the White Pass Trail had to be closed due to the awful conditions and rotting horseflesh. Ultimately, improvements were made to the route, and attempts to collect tolls were also tried. Many stampeders used the frozen Skagway River or simply knocked down the toll gates. The construction of the 40-mile White Pass and Yukon Railroad route to Lake Bennett from May 27, 1898 to July 6, 1899 spelled the end of the use of the White Pass Trail. The railroad was built to alleviate the hardships of the gruesome trip over the trails to the gold fields in the interior of the Yukon. By the time the railroad was completed, the rush was over. But the railroad line survived nevertheless, and it continues to this day as a fantastic tourist train ride. When the snow fell and the mud froze that winter of 1898, the White Pass Trail, which had been closed for months, reopened. Even with the help of oxen, horses, and sledges, men under the strain of returning again and again for a new load, only to find it buried under a dozen feet of snow, were driven to lunacy. Few could carry more than 60 to 70 pounds at a time, and so they moved in 5-mile stages over and over and over again. Some men covered hundreds of miles on foot before reaching Lake Bennett. Even those fortunate enough to drag weightier loads on sledges took a minimum of 90 days to go through the White Pass Trail. For every man who reached the summit, another turned back. Some threw themselves exhausted on the side of the trail and gave up. Some grew deathly ill from rotten horse meat served at little trailside cafes. Some sickened and died from the grip, pneumonia, or meningitis. Some ran out of food and could go no further. Some were turned back by the Northwest Mounted Police, who guarded the border, and then there were those who simply could not be discouraged, who saw the Klondike experience as an enormous adventure, to be relished and enjoyed for its own sake, who met adversity on its own terms and surmounted it. The other option to Lake Bennett was over the 33-mile Chilkoot Trail out of Dyea, marked in red. Because this trail turned out to be so popular, it hosted a series of camps and towns every few miles along the route. All were temporary, that lasted less than 2 years. Canyon City, halfway between Dyea and the summit of Chilkoot Pass, housed a floating population of 1,500 people during the spring of 1898. Sheep Camp, just below the timberline, once numbered over 6,000 people. It had more than 60 small businesses, most of them small hotels, restaurants, or taverns. The people who set up businesses along the trail usually made more money than most of the prospectors heading for the Klondike. Sheep Camp was a bedlam of sweating men, howling dogs, and abandoned horses. Here were 15 little hotels, none worthy of the name, where an exhausted man could pay 2 days' wages for a single meal or a small fortune for the privilege of sleeping on the floor. The most memorable portion of the Klondike trek was the final ascent from Sheep Camp to the 3,739-foot summit of Chilkoot Pass, at the bottom of which was the scales. Here, professional packers reweighed their loads, increasing the tariff to $1 a pound. No animal could carry a load past the scales. Everything must be carried over on men's backs. An endless string of men climbed the golden stairs, steps chipped in the ice with a rope strung along the way for guidance. 1,200 steps were cut up a 35-degree slope for a total vertical climb of 500 feet. If a man got off the trail for any reason, it sometimes took him hours to get back in line. So steady was the procession. Once at the top, the packer returned by the quickest means, either sliding to the bottom on a shovel or on his back. It could take up to 30 to 40 trips to the summit and back down to get his required 2,000 pounds of supplies assembled in one place. In a 2-year period, up to 30,000 men, women, and even some children walked over the trail. The Chilkoot Trail was truly an international settlement. There were people from nearly every nation in the Western Hemisphere, and a few from the Far East. At times, it was something of a Tower of Babel, as the people included folks from New Zealand, former slaves from the American South, cowboys from Texas, Swedes, Norwegians, Germans, Swiss, South Africans, South Americans, Australians, and prostitutes from each ethnic group. Teenagers were taken along and used as work animals by desperate relatives. Denver's most famous and successful madam took 8 girls over the pass and downriver to Dawson. Missionaries went in hopes men would remember their souls. College athletes quit school, and some worked as packers to finance their sabbatical. Lawyers from New York City tucked their shingles under their arms and hiked the trail. Only on Ellis Island in the New York harbor could a census taker have found such a complete cross-section of humanity. Crime was not a great problem on the trail because everyone was intent on getting his own supplies through. And there were few places for criminals to hide. Mishaps, accidents, sickness, death, even murder did not move them. But theft drove them to a fury, for theft was the most heinous of crimes that winter. A man who had his outfit stolen knew that he had lost his chance at fortune's wheel. Any man caught stealing could expect swift justice, to be stripped to the waist, tied to a post, and lashed unmercifully. This chap was probably sent back down to Dyea and forbidden to push on to the gold fields. 70 feet of snow fell on the Chilkoot summit in the winter of 1897-98. The city of supplies shown here was one of two that piled up that winter, and both were buried beneath the snows. Men were forced to dig for dozens of feet to find their own goods. Some supplies were not dug out until spring. With snowstorms, strong winds, and temperatures down to 50 degrees below zero, it is a wonder that anyone survived. The White Pass and Chilkoot Trails both ended at Lake Bennett in British Columbia. And from there, it was a 550-mile float trip down the Yukon River to Dawson. All through the summer and fall of 1897 and the winter of 1898, thousands of stampeders crossed the passes to the lakes and began the long process of building boats to float the river. Those who reached the lakes before freeze-up could leave immediately if they had packed boats with them. But most were held up at the lakes, building their boats until the spring 1898 breakup. And this turned the closest friends quite often into bitterest enemies when whipsawing lumber into planks, as shown in this picture here. You can imagine what the fellow underneath was receiving every time that saw went back down in his face. The town of Lake Bennett became the largest tent city in the world. By the spring of 1898, it had a population of more than 10,000 people. The forests for miles around had been cleared to provide the lumber necessary to build thousands of boats. Vessels of every description were under construction, although most of the people had never built a boat before. At last, on May 29, 1898, with a creak and a rumble, the rotting ice broke, and the great boat race to the Klondike began. Within 48 hours, the lakes were clear of ice, and a flotilla of 7,124 boats began the long glide to the Klondike. Now, as a young breeze wafted down the Alpine corridor, catching the sails, the stampeders settled back in their vessels and savored the experience. Again, the spectacle was unique. Thousands of boats speckling a lake that had, until this year, been silent as a tomb. Nothing like it had ever been seen before, and nothing like it would ever be seen again. The men in the boats began to sing, and for a moment, the race was forgotten, and so was the grim canyon that lay ahead. Miles Canyon was the first major obstacle along the river after the boats left Lake Bennett. It was the end of the trip for many who, in their hurry to get down the river, tried to ride the water through the narrow canyon. The walls rose more than 100 feet above the water, which rushed through a narrow opening and created a dangerous whirlpool. And if the boat made it through the canyon, it had to contend with rapids just below. The rocks, tree roots, and sandbars tore the bottom out of many boats, and 150 were wrecked and 5 men were lost. In the last few days on the river, the boatmen traveled without pause, each man taut with tension as the miles glided by. None knew exactly where the town was located, so all hugged the right bank for fear of being swept past. Then at last, each boat rounded a rocky bluff, and there it was, an incredible miscellany of tents, log cabins, and false-fronted emporiums, all jammed together, a weird metropolis mushrooming out of the wilderness, 1,000 miles from civilization. As each man steered his boat to the shore, he must have wondered if it was real. Yes, it was very real. This was Dawson. This was the goal he had set for himself, and after many weary months had achieved. Between 1896 and 1899, Dawson had grown from a mud flat to the largest Canadian city north of Vancouver and west of Winnipeg, with a population of more than 30,000 people. For 1 year, from June 1898 to July 1899, it was one of the grandest cities in North America, where one could do or buy most anything that one had money for. This was the end of the rainbow. This was the city of gold. In conclusion, the Klondike fever lasted just 2 years, from midsummer 1897, when the first news reached the outside world, until midsummer 1899, when word of a new gold strike in Nome, Alaska, emptied Dawson. But in that brief period, thousands of men lived a lifetime. They realized that the Klondike experience was as much a quest for self as it was for gold. These men had learned that they're capable of feats none could have imagined possible in the years before the stampede. Who today would care to repeat the travail of the gold seekers of 1898? Who would climb the Chilkoot not once, but 40 times with 60 pounds on his back and a blizzard howling in his face? Who would build his own boat and navigate a river, canyon, and rapids for over 500 miles? Who would live on pork and beans for months with the temperature dropping below minus 60 degrees at some time? Yet in the space of 2 crazy seasons, close to 30,000 men and women and some children did just that. It would be strange indeed if the experience had not transformed them. Some, as we have seen, were changed for the worse, but the great majority emerged from the north with a new sense of confidence, a new sense of purpose, and above all, the sure knowledge that nothing worthwhile in this world is easily gained. And I thank you for your interest in this great moment in history.